main greenhouse gas in the atmosphere is water vapor.
That accompanied the paper was wrong.
So let's hear what you're not being told about climate change.
About 5,000 years ago, the world was much warmer than it is today.
The sun's changes is one reason why the Earth has climate change.
Somebody, somewhere, should check the calculations.
Greenhouse gas number 1, 2, 3, and 4 is water vapor, with carbon dioxide would be a distant 5.
I used to agree with these dramatic warnings of climate disaster. I taught my students that most of the increase in temperature of the past century was due to human contributions of CO2. The association seemed so clear and simple. Increases of greenhouse gases were driving us towards a climate catastrophe. However, a few years ago I decided to look more closely at the science, and it astonished me. In fact, there is no evidence of humans being the cause. There is, however, overwhelming evidence of natural causes, such as changes in the output of the sun. This has completely reversed my views on the Kyoto Protocol. Actually, many other leading climate researchers also have serious concerns about the science underlying the protocol. So let's hear what you're not being told about climate change.
The field of climate science is vast, and I should emphasize rapidly evolving. Many things we thought we knew about the climate system just a few years ago are now proving to be highly uncertain or quite mistaken.
So what causes climate change? Recent research indicates that the causes are mostly natural, and in many cases, not even originating on Earth.
There is much new evidence showing the sun has cycles over centuries. The Earth has warmings and coolings that follow in step with the sun. The sun's changes is one reason why the Earth has climate change.
In our research, we are showing the excellent correlation between the regular fluctuations in the brightness of the sun and earthly temperatures, and hundreds of other studies have shown similar trends.
We're in a very warm period right now in the last decade or so. High solar activity. The last time that we had a level of solar activity this high was almost 8,000 years ago. Interesting, though, there's lots of new research coming up looking at the sun's solar conveyor belt. Here we are at the present time, right here, just entering solar cycle 24. The conveyor belt in the sun is actually, they can see it slowing. It's projected that it's going to probably be the weakest one since the very early part of the 1800s. Okay, so as we move ahead, starting probably in the early 2020s, and move into this very, very weak solar cycle, we could be heading into a situation analogous to what was occurring during some parts of the Little Ice Age.
And in 2000, we reached a peak of sunspot activity, which is why it's been warmer for the last 1,000 years. So they're predicting that to continue cooling, which is a trend we're starting to see now. The whole world's preparing for warming. So, they've scared us into preparing for completely the wrong thing.
So many things that affect climate, and some exciting news is that probably the galaxy affects climate as well. The galaxy affects the climate of Earth.
Here's the energy variation across the sunspot cycle. It works out to about 0.1% variation in energy, okay, that's striking the Earth. The problem is, if you were going to rely on that to drive temperature change, okay, about 0.2 degrees Celsius. So let's step aside then and look about what possible amplifiers we have out there. So let's look at the clouds as an amplifier. Now, there are two types of clouds then, things that can happen. You can either have heating by clouds, which will actually warm up the Earth by a greenhouse effect, or you can have cooling by clouds, a negative force. And so the more clouds you get, you tend to end up with an overall cooling. So that's the relationship. So remember, more clouds, more cooling. Things that have come out in the last little while are galactic cosmic rays in climate. Now, what galactic cosmic rays are? They're just bits and pieces of stripped down neutrons and all kinds of little high energy particles. They're basically released when supernova occurs. So basically when a star blows up. The cosmic rays are hitting our solar system all the time, but counteracting that is the solar wind. Okay? So the more solar wind that you have coming off our solar system, it tends to deflect cosmic rays away. So it's interesting, there's some papers that come out that show some really cool correlations. There's a correlation between the sunspot cycle, the galactic cosmic rays, and global cloudiness. There's a 1.7% variation in clouds across the sunspot cycle. This is measured. This is not any hypothetical anything between a maximum and a minimum. I'd say 85% of the projected warming that the IPCC has proposed for CO2 since the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And this is just across one sunspot cycle. This is an amplifier. Okay, so we have this really interesting correlation. So during low clouds, it's warmer. And during high clouds up here, it is cooler, and it's all correlating with galactic cosmic rays, which seem to be able to result in a nucleation of these clouds.
Research done by climate scientists in the 1990s resulted in the conclusion that cosmic rays influence Earth's climate through their effect on cloud formation. In 2006, the Danish National Space Center published results on their experiments, which supported these earlier conclusions. They established a causal mechanism, an amplifier, by which cosmic rays facilitate the formation of clouds in Earth's atmosphere. This now allows climate scientists to include cosmic rays as natural climate drivers.
We now can explain how we have all these interesting correlations, which we couldn't explain up until the last couple of years. So this is how the science is changing.
Trying to understand the causes of climate change is akin to putting together an extraordinarily complex jigsaw puzzle in which we are still missing many key pieces.
We haven't even got all the edge pieces, and we really haven't got some of the corner pieces.
A common misconception amongst the general public is that temperatures are rapidly increasing. This is only with some of the surface data, and it's selected surface data. In fact, if much of the surface data that's collected is from around urban areas or areas which have had significant land use change, and this data is contaminated. On the other hand, satellites provide comprehensive coverage of the Earth 24/7 for the last 20 years. And so what they have demonstrated is that there has been an almost imperceptible rise in temperature over this time.
But is there really much difference between temperatures in cities and that of the rest of the world?
I did studies in Winnipeg 25 years ago. We were measuring the heat island of the city of Winnipeg, and we found as much as 10 degrees Celsius difference between Portage and Maine, which is supposedly the coldest part of Winnipeg, and the airport 8 kilometers away.
Most cities of the world are hotter than their surrounding environments. That has nothing to do with carbon dioxide, and it has everything to do with land use.
What about the relatively warm year 1998? Was that global warming or a naturally occurring event, such as El Nino?
In 1997-98, we had a major El Nino develop at low latitude, and there was a tremendous amount of water vapor pumped up in the atmosphere, and we had a 1 degree Celsius spike around the world that was noted at that time that disappeared within a few months.
It's not even 25 years ago that the great threat was global cooling. You go back to the 70s and 76, and people like Ponte publishing books called The Cooling. And the scientific consensus then was that we were headed for cooling.
But surely climate change is happening. Do scientists have any doubt?
Climate always changes. It always has, and it always will, no matter what humans are doing.
And based on the paleoclimatic data that I and others have collected, it's obvious that climate is and always has been variable. In fact, the only constant about climate is change. It changes continually.
In a brochure sent to every household across the country, Environment Canada asserted that after 900 years of relatively constant temperature, the 20th century was suddenly warmer. The warmest in a millennium, they said. This was certainly different to what scientists had concluded before 1998.
Past climate researchers have found out that over much of the world, between about 1400 and in some places as late as 1900, there was a period of colder than average temperatures over many regions of the world called the Little Ice Age. And before that, There was a period of unusual warmth. So warming and cooling are the norm. The 20th century is not out of bounds compared to the past.
So that created a very familiar curve that appeared in the early IPCC reports. And then suddenly, in 1998, a study came out, which is now referred to as the MBH 98, because the three authors' names, the first one is the one that's spoken about the most, which is Mann, published a report in which they completely rejected that widely accepted temperature graph.
The MBH98 graph became known as the hockey stick curve, where the shaft of the stick was the relatively constant lower temperatures for the first 900 years of the past millennium, and the blade of the stick the reputed sudden temperature rise of the past century. Although Mann's research was never audited, the United Nations and environmentalists promoted it as the smoking gun that recent warming was unusual. Finally, in 2003, Canadian analyst Stephen McIntyre, in cooperation with Ross McKitrick of the University of Guelph, decided to take a closer look at the data.
We carried out an analysis of the results to see what happened when we recompiled the data, and got quite different answers. Instead of having an extraordinarily high 20th century, we had a 15th century value that was just as high as the 20th century. So the hockey stick disappeared. It's a computer programming error that yields these hockey sticks. This piece of the jigsaw puzzle needs to be removed before science can develop a proper understanding of the climate history of the last millennium. Here's a study that appeared in the world's top science journal, and yet years went by and they never noticed that the data description that accompanied the paper was wrong, that there were very important methodological issues that weren't described in the paper.
Last year's Arctic Climate Impact Assessment made some very dramatic but highly unrealistic predictions. That the first graph to appear in the report is the hockey stick makes one naturally suspicious.
They made up what they were going to do beforehand and then chose whatever science they could find which they thought might support it. That's my view. They had another scare a few years ago because one of the people from the IPCC went on an Arctic cruise, you see, and he was absolutely amazed to find there was open sea. And he put an article in the New York Times saying, you know, this proves global warming. He had failed to notice that the Northwest Passage was first negotiated by a man called Roald Amundsen in 1906.
Recent research shows that 8,000 years ago, temperatures were 6 to 8 degrees higher in the Arctic than today, and that dramatic changes occurred in only a few decades. Nevertheless, polar bears and other Arctic wildlife obviously adapted and survived, and so are also not threatened today.
About 5,000 years ago, the world was much warmer than it is today, and warmer even than they're forecasting for the most extreme global warming forecasts.
While we should strive to minimize air, water, and land pollution, there is no need to concern ourselves about carbon dioxide.
What carbon dioxide is essential for life on Earth. Plants eat it. It is plant food. And in fact, as carbon dioxide has increased in the air over the last 50 years, plants have grown better, more vigorously, faster. Farmers have gotten a little extra bounty in their crops for free because there's more carbon dioxide in the air. Without carbon dioxide, there would not be life on Earth. We wouldn't be here. It is essential to us.
Okay, research has shown that increases of CO2 concentration of 2, 3, 4, 5 times would not have a detrimental effect upon the Earth's biosphere.
University of Ottawa geology professor Dr. Jan Visser has recently demonstrated that changes in atmospheric carbon dioxide have had little effect on Earth's long-term temperature in comparison with natural causes. The thick blue line at the top of this graph shows the changes in carbon dioxide in the past 500 million years. The red line below is a plot of temperatures found by Professor Visser. Over this time frame, there is no meaningful correlation between carbon dioxide levels and Earth's temperature. In fact, when CO2 levels were over 10 times higher than they are today, about 450 million years ago, our planet was in the depths of the absolute coldest period in the last $500 million years. But what about the ice core records of the past 500,000 years that show CO2 levels and temperature moving in lockstep?
When we look at the ice core record, here from Vostok in Antarctica, we see that the temperature record and the CO2 record from these ancient atmospheres follow very closely one to another. But when we look more closely at the detail, we see that the temperature record increases first. The CO2 record lags the temperature by up to 800 years. In other words, CO2 is acting as a result of temperature rise and not a cause of temperature increase.
When the Vikings were sailing in Arctic waters, and when the Vikings were farming in Greenland in soil that's now permanently frozen, the question is then what caused that warming? It certainly wasn't human-produced CO2.
The UN's IPCC assessment report states that the rise of CO2 concentrations over the last 150 years has been dramatic. But is this really the case? Actually, no. CO2 concentrations that have been measured in the atmosphere in the last 200 years by a number of scientists, including 2 Nobel Prize laureates, and have recently been compiled by chemist Ernst Georg Beck. This shows that today's CO2 concentrations are typical of the last 200 years and are well below peaks achieved twice in the past. The details and interpretations of Beck's results are still being discussed, but it appears that the flat pre-industrial CO2 levels assumed by the IPCC is not a tenable concept.
In fact, the world has been generally cooling since 1998, despite the continuing rise in CO2.
And then to add insult to injury to this idea that the influence of CO2 on climate, we actually had a decline in temperature from the 1940s through to about the late 1970s to about 1980. When all this while, CO2 levels were increasing like crazy all around the world.
CO2 is not the major greenhouse gas anyway.
In fact, if you wanted to categorize greenhouse gases, to paraphrase a colleague of mine, he says that greenhouse gas number 1, 2, 3, and 4 is water vapor, with carbon dioxide would be a distant 5. The celestial forcing of climate is the most important influence on our climate, with CO2 has an influence, but it's certainly not significant enough for us to worry about.
On the basis of this evidence, how could anyone still believe that the recent relatively small increases in CO2 levels that you see in Figure 3 of your handout would be the major cause of the past century's modest warming?
We frequently hear that the incidence and severity of extreme weather, such things as hurricanes, blizzards, droughts, and floods, are increasing, and that global warming is the cause.
The argument is that we're going to have an increase of drought, and it's another part of the scare tactics. Well, more severe weather, more droughts, and so on. When you look at the long-term record, what you see is that droughts are cyclical. They do alternate, but you also see there are far worse droughts in the past than we've had in the modern record.
History shows that storm frequency and intensity is greatest in colder periods. The extreme weather of the Little Ice Age provides a good example.
The storms were much more dramatic. The storms would come in and wipe out villages along the northern coast, 400,000 people at a time. It's storms not seen since.
But what about fears of catastrophic sea level changes that, we are told, will soon submerge small islands?
The background increase in sea level rise has been about 20 centimeters per century for the last few thousand years. There is no scientific evidence whatsoever that this background rate is increasing.
But didn't the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, conclude that human activities are causing disastrous climate change? No, they did not. Most government and media get the wrong impression by only reading the summaries for policymakers. the alarmist and misleading overviews of the IPCC's science reports.
Now, this summary for policymakers isn't a summary for policymakers at all. It's a summary by policymakers. In other words, it is a summary which is agreed line by line by government representatives.
But didn't the IPCC establish that our release of greenhouse gases caused the past century's modest warming?
They have not established that greenhouse gases are warming the Earth. And what's more, in Chapter 1, there is a statement by the author of that chapter which states very clearly that in their opinion, although there have been changes in the climate, they could very well be natural. One of the biggest spoofs of the IPCC is that they try and play down the fact that the main greenhouse gas in the atmosphere is water vapor.
Among the many problems with the IPCC, perhaps the most serious is that research is selected to support their point of view without proper audit. The hockey stick fiasco is a prime example.
So as we look at the report itself, there's one graph that comes out over and over, and that's the hockey stick graph. They think so much of it, they have it twice on the same page here, and you just can't miss the hockey stick. It's the central icon for the IPCC's argument.
All of these multi-proxy studies need to be looked at from top to bottom prior to their incorporation in the next round of UN studies. Clearly, between the journal publication and its use by IPCC, somebody somewhere should check the calculations.
They sometimes take notice of your comments. I mean, they don't take much notice of mine because most of the time I don't agree with what they're saying. The IPCC is a political organisation set up by the United Nations to provide evidence to support the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has been signed by governments. It is entirely political.
Where the governments have placed all their belief in the IPCC have placed all their faith in the computer models.
If you want to put in everything that one thinks is relevant to the climate system in the model, it would encompass 5 million different variables.
There is not a computer in the world with the capacity to handle the data, but more important, to handle all of the calculations of interaction and complexities of the climate.
The forecasts of a 1.5 to 4.5 degree increase in temperature are made by computer models that are incapable of properly handling the most important greenhouse gas of all, water vapor.
Now, the Antarctic has had measurements made for the past 50 years, and it's cooling, you see. And this is the opposite of what the models predict, and they have an awful trouble trying to figure this out.
What appears to be unnatural change is actually natural change. And by identifying natural change as unnatural, they're virtually never wrong.
Governments need a totally new way to approach the science of climate change.
But what they can't have is a situation where people just yank a paper out of the literature without having done any kind of analysis of it or verification of it and say, on this basis, we're going to start spending billions of dollars. That's just a recipe for disaster.
If Canada's government is to base climate policy on real science, then they must accept that their policy decisions should be changeable as climate science advances. Otherwise, policy becomes disconnected from science, and we may waste billions of dollars going in entirely the wrong direction.
The problems with the UN IPCC process is evident in the 2007 Fourth Assessment Report. In fact, the release of the summary for policymakers preceded the main scientific report. Delay in the release of the 1,600-page report was, in the words of the IPCC, needed for the adjustment of the main text so that changes could be made to ensure consistency with the summary for policymakers. In other words, the summary was released prior to the finalization of the scientific backup. That is equal to giving the final score of the game before it is played. Also, interestingly, the Fourth Assessment Report did reduce the IPCC's global warming projections, reduce the estimate of human contribution to global temperature rise, reduce projected sea level rise. And incredibly, they abandoned the discredited hockey stick graph, suggesting that they are no longer claiming that the late 20th century temperatures were the highest in the last 1,000 years.
There is no doubt, however, that natural climate change will be hard on some people, so we need to help them adapt.
My conclusion then for you then is that natural cyclic celestial phenomena are really major drivers of climate change around there. They have a really profound influence on our climate and biological processes. And so again, I leave you, the only constant about climate is change, and the only thing we can do about it is we need to deal with real issues like pollution, clean drinking water to Africa, all these sorts of real tangible things that we can get our hand on. Adaptation is the critical strategy, and to go deal with the real environmental issues.
Speaking out, as we have on this video, is uncomfortable and distracts us from the work we love. But scientists have a serious obligation to advise society to look at this issue. We sincerely hope that you will look at the facts and weigh the consequences of Kyoto. It is surely one of the most misguided endeavors of our age.